I was invited in September to give a lecture on the following topic: positions on the State of Israel in the context of eschatological decisions. One reason for inviting me for this must have been my doctoral thesis of 2007 on a similar topic: Christian Zionism among evangelicals in the Federal Republic of Germany. 2007, it's been a while. I've therefore taken the invitation as an opportunity to review recent research on the subject of Christian Zionism, and not only in the Federal Republic of Germany. What in my thesis has proven itself, has been confirmed, what would have to be supplemented or perhaps even corrected? Let me add this: I'm not going to include full references. If you want those, if you want to see which studies, books, at least a number of them that have been published since 2007, you'll have to go and look at it on the website wilrens.org. I started that lecture with a picture of this lady in a t-shirt with an Israel flag on it and the text Israel. I asked the question, who is this, where, when? I can't include that original picture for copyright reasons. But obviously, it's a photo of Michelle Bolsonaro, and the one in the Israel t-shirt was taken October 2022 as she was voting for the presidential elections in Brazil. Her husband lost that election by a narrow margin. And with it, in an Instagram post, came this text: "May the blessing of our God be upon Brazil and Israel. God, homeland, family, and freedom." What does this mean? We'll come back to this. In what follows, I'd like to present 3 points that I feel have been confirmed from my original thesis, and then in the next issue propose 3 important additions. Of course, there are positions on the State of Israel that do not regard it as a theological entity and are neutral or even critical of it. And equally, of course, this is also associated with an eschatological decision. For instance, that we do not know how God will fulfill his prophetic promise to biblical Israel. Is the State of Israel really this fulfillment? Can we be sure? Or that we find the ethical message of the prophets more important, and therefore argue that an action or a policy that fulfills prophecy is not justified by it. Often questions of justice then take on the leading role rather than of prophecy. And of course, it's possible to be pro-Israel without taking sides too one-sidedly. In Germany, precisely such an attitude is widespread in the pietistic evangelical circles associated with the Evangelical Alliance. On them, I wrote, quote, "Overall, it can be said that large parts of the evangelical movement in Germany are determined by a pro-Israel attitude that can best be described with the term solidarity with Israel. The decisive factors are the expectation of restoration of Israel and premillennialism, the dogmatic and ideological militancy that characterized the Christian Zionism so often is by no means always evident. Often representatives strive for moderation, balance, and equilibrium, and want to avoid one-sidedness or partisanships, even if this does not always succeed." Now, I suspect that most official bodies in Germany today would still position themselves in a similarly cautious manner. But that's a different topic. So, first of all, what has been confirmed? 3 points. First, there is, on the one hand, restorationism, a belief in the restoration of Israel somehow, as a people, as a country, whether before or after the conversion to the Christian Messiah, which is also expected, and Christian Zionism. In my opinion, this distinction is of fundamental importance. Now, the first one, restorationism, is a pure expectation, often passive. It developed after the Reformation. Old Testament prophecies and promises were taken literally in some circles, especially by the Puritans in England, and later also by the Pietists in Germany. And this at least created the possibility of perceiving Jews and Judaism more positively. Often was potential only, but in principle, this was an eschatological decision that also made a country of Israel conceivable again. Somewhat similar ideas sometimes popped up in the Middle Ages as well, but mostly among marginalized groups, and there doesn't appear to be a direct connection to what the Puritans developed in the 16th century in English Protestantism, a new development. But these restorationists remained largely passive. They may have started a mission to the Jews, but most of the time nothing more. And this remained the case in Germany until long after the Second World War, and not only there. There's a study published in 2014 by Timo Stewart, which describes a similar situation in Finland for the years 1947 to 1949. Many Christians were enthusiastic about the fulfillment of prophecy. No one advertised that something should be done to help this new state. Now, Christian Zionism, on the other hand, takes action. It has a practical, a political, and ideological component. Support for the State of Israel is active, concrete, and not just mental in the realm of ideas. One book, by the way, that deserves special mention is Donald Lewis, 2021, A Short History of Christian Zionism, from the Reformation to the 21st Century. Now, the title is not quite right. It's not a short book, and a substantial part of it deals with the idea of restoration, which Lewis himself distinguishes from Christian Zionism and dispensationalism. Christian Zionism is understood by Lewis as a movement that develops from the idea of restoration, something I absolutely agree with. But too often, restorationism and Christian Zionism are still equated or confused. In addition, they are also connected or even equated with dispensationalism, as if dispensationalism and its popular theological offshoots had given rise to Christian Zionism. Dispensationalism has indeed adopted the restoration of Israel in its end-time scenario, but belief in the restoration of Israel towards the end of time does not have to be dispensationalism. In fact, strictly speaking, Christian Zionism and classic original dispensationalism, as formulated by John Nelson Darby, are at odds with each other. God's plan for and with Israel, so Darby, should only restart after the rapture, and therefore there is nothing to support before the rapture. Early dispensationalism was certainly not Christian Zionist, neither was John Nelson Darby. The distinction between a movement of Christian Zionism and an expectation or idea of restoration helps us to understand the origin of the movement and the motivation of its followers. Some critics of Christian Zionism like to portray it as Armageddon theology. Titles like Anxious for Armageddon, Donald Wagner, and Christian Zionism Roadmap to Armageddon do that. Both books written by evangelical authors. As they see it, a longing for the end of the world inspires the movement. In that case, the eschatological decision would be primary and all-determining. Matthew Westbrook wrote a doctoral thesis on the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem in 2014, and the entire second chapter of his dissertation deals with this question of dispensationalism and the origins of Christian Zionism. It's a long chapter. And Matthew Westbrook draws a similar conclusion as I did about, quote, the connection made by the majority of historians and scholars of religion between Christian Zionism and the 19th, 20th century theological movement known as dispensational premillennialism, a connection which is ubiquitous in the scholarly literature but deeply problematic. I will argue that this connection is misleading as to both the beginning of Christian Zionism and its various present manifestations. So far, Matthew Westbrook. Phaedra Shapiro, an Orthodox Jew of American origin, writes, "In my research, it became clear very quickly that the connection between premillennial dispensationalism and Christian Zionism has been vastly overdrawn. Overwhelmingly, my informants either did not consider themselves dispensationalists or, more often, did not know what it or premillennialism meant. The International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem, for example, has repudiated dispensationalism's teachings and officially distanced itself from dispensationalism." And Stephen Spector, an American Jew, notes, 2009, "Many commentators have argued, moreover, that these religious convictions helped define US foreign policy under George W. Bush. I was prepared to discover that influence too. I found instead an unexpected pragmatism, flexibility and nuance in evangelicals. I also found a lot of disagreement and uncertainty about the end of days." The claim that all Christian Zionists adamantly demand that Israel keep every inch of its biblical territory is vastly overstated. So is the charge that they are yearning for the Jews to convert or die at the end of time. And many of the most prominent evangelical supporters of Israel, despite their uncompromising public declarations, acknowledge that they will respect the right of the democratically elected Israeli government to give up land in the hope of gaining peace. And then Spector writes something important. "For very many born-again Christians, the chief biblical imperative," remember we're talking about motivation and origin here, "to bless Israel is God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12 verse 3, which promises a reward for those who bless the Jews and punishment for those who curse them. This verse is by far the most prominent reason that evangelicals cite for their backing of the State of Israel. Every evangelical Zionist I spoke with, leaders and laity alike, from Jerusalem to Washington, D.C. to Midland, Texas, wherever that is, alluded to this promise of blessing for those who bless Israel." Now, admittedly, the end-time reflex runs deep. When COVID and the Russian war against Ukraine came, I was asked by friends from whom I did not expect this, is this a sign of the end times? Is this Gog from Magog against Israel? As if the Ukraine war is about Israel. So there is end time fever. Is that how the enthusiasm for Israel can be explained? Well, sometimes yes, because there definitely is an apocalyptic form of this movement. I don't deny that, but it's not the only form. By the way, especially in that apocalyptic form, when the end times play the main role, one has to wonder if it's really about Jews or Israelis as human beings. Robert Smith published a study in 2013 in which he quotes Gershom Gorenberg. And Gorenberg complains that Jews here are actors in a Christian drama leading toward the end of days, and then goes on to say real Zionism as a Jewish movement is a movement aimed at taking Jews out of the mythological realm and making them into normal actors in history, controlling their fate and acting for pragmatic reasons connected to the here and now. So what's called Christian Zionism is actually very distant from Zionism. So Gorenberg. And Phaedra Shapiro goes a little further. What Jews are for Christian Zionists is exceptional. Jews are not just people. They are fraught with significance, and the Jewishness, not their humanity, is the most important thing about them. But at the same time, such end-time fever is not the whole story. There are different paths that lead to support and enthusiasm for Israel. The motivations are more complex and diverse than an end-time reflects. For many, Israel has become the key to understanding world affairs. One sees oneself actively involved in God's plan for the world, in the history of salvation, in its completion. This is also eschatology, but different. Or Israel becomes the key to one's own personal or national identity. The latter is especially true for American Christian Zionism, as shown by Smith and Durbin. And then a deep concern about the history of Jewish-Christian relations often plays an important role, and not only in Germany. An encounter with Israel and Jews, including with the Jewish state, is also important. Such an encounter can be very emotional and make a deep impact. One can certainly speak of love for the Jewish people and for Israel. May be criticized that Israel and Judaism are just being co-opted for Christian purposes, as Gorenberg and Shapiro do. In my opinion, it does not take away from the fact that at the same time a deeply felt love can play a significant role. Another study from 2014 by Aaron Engberg described the case extensively of a Swedish Christian whose first visit to Israel sparked a passionate love at first sight. This was the reason for this person to quit his job in Sweden, return to Israel, and then attempt to join the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and he served in the Israeli army. And Engberg in his study identifies love as the central element, as he puts it, motivating his personal engagement with Israel. This kind of love can lead to a second nationalism. People find part of their identity and that of their group or nation in Israel. Now think back to Michelle Bolsonaro and her Israel t-shirt on Election Day in Brazil. Recent research confirms this broader view of what moves the movement, especially this aspect of a second or double nationalism. It's also possible to define one's own national identity, in part at least, by this other nation. Robert Smith, 2013, describes the identity formation of Great Britain and America in the past based on exceptionalism, belief in the special vocation of the two nations, especially with regards to Israel, for America to this day. Matthew Westbrook, International Christian Embassy of Jerusalem, uses the term ethno-nationalism for this in his dissertation. It's the topic in chapter 6 of his thesis, a whole chapter. We'll come back to this idea. But it's a very specific form of ethno-nationalism. The ethnicity, the ethnic group, is not one's own, but still serves the vision for one's own nation or state. In such cases, eschatology is not absent, but it's not the determining factor, and it's not necessarily fixated on Armageddon. Now we come to point 3. My evaluation of popular theological literature on the topics of the end times and Israel clearly showed that in charismatic Pentecostal circles, especially Neo-Pentecostal, Christian Zionism has taken on its own features and differs significantly. It forms its own type. These features include parallel restoration of Israel and the Church, for instance, the beginning of Zionism in the late 19th century and the Balfour Declaration of 1917, and then the beginning of Pentecostalism in 1906. The revival of the Hebrew language and the reappearance of speaking in tongues. the conquest of Jerusalem in 1967, and the beginning of the Messianic Jewish movement and the Jesus movement, as well as the breakthrough of the charismatic movement and the more traditional churches. There's the adoption of Jewish customs, artifacts, and festivals. There's the idea of the one new man, made up out of Jews and Gentiles, an idea based on Ephesians 2 verse 15. In this view, that one new man is not something that happened in the past on the cross, but it's happening now, when Jews and Gentile Christians come together, which is therefore of great importance in the history of salvation. Jews and Christians are brothers and sisters, they are one, so this view. There's a unique role ascribed to Israel, for instance, bringing in the Greater Riches World Revival. And there are many additional positive and optimistic elements in its end-time expectation. Now, it all sounds very eschatological, but I repeat, it's not the eschatology of end-time scenarios as we know it from dispensationalism and end-time books. We tend to be much more pessimistic about the world. This turbo eschatology also acknowledges dark sides. The future is not only golden, but it seems to lose itself above all in exuberance. Israel, Messianic Jews, and the Christians who support them are playing the leading role in the last days. Again, I turn to Matthew Westbrook. The existence of such a variation of Christian Zionism with ethno-nationalism as an essential feature, that's his main thesis in 2014. And he refers to this as renewalist Christian Zionism. By the way, yet another new study by Daniel Hummel, 2017-2019, agrees. Hummel speaks of the new Christian Zionism, and with that he means a type that is international and strongly Pentecostal and less determined by end-time issues. So far, so good. But what did I miss? To be continued.
Show me starting with a few months.